you can start your talk. Welcome
Okay.
to Innsbruck from
Great, thank you guys for having me. It's a pretty exciting group of speakers. I just caught the end of Harold's presentation. It seems like there's going to be a lot of kind of similar themes or intentions behind a lot of work we're doing. Just like a quick note before I get started, I had to relocate from the hotel to a friend of mine's office in Brooklyn, which means that Jose probably won't be able to join us for the afternoon session, unfortunately. But I'll be around. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. There's been a lot of discussion, or when I first got kind of the invitation to speak from Ryan Manning, who reached out to me, and then through Daniel, there was the initial topic was presented to me. It was about discreteness and the conversation about discrete, which I thought was kind of interesting relative to my work, and that I hadn't thought about my work that way for a while. However, this is an old project from about 2008 that I did a while ago, and it kind of more kind of literally in a kind of banal way begins to fit into the idea of the part to whole and the kind of mirrorological as a kind of tectonic agent-based system of bodies. And I wanted to kind of just read a quick excerpt from Daniel's book that I thought applies to this. Designer's intention of the city blocks and the city block and the building and its element, the determination of the individual apartment and the settlement as a contour of the specific architecture as a composition, the form of the settlement as a composition of the architecture, and the concept of parts of the settlement as a form of the concept of form of the city planning. The design of the city block consists of a content. The concept of architecture is not a specific architectural elements. The form of the architectural form as a composition of the figure is described by architectural elements of the settlement. The figure is not a street on the parts of the mass of the specific architectural elements of the city. Without that, in the city is the subjective experience and the problem of the city blocks with the concept of parts of the space. The political studies of the study of the city is not a whole, it is not an evocation. The Bauhaus, Hippelsmeyer describes the form of the architectural elements of the settlement as a composition of parts of the settlement, as a possible for a representation of the study of the settlement. The figure consists of the city, is not a street. The determination of your proposal towns of the city block and the city elements is the contrast to the single compositional form. The figure is a compositional street compositions. The house in the settlement is also a composition of the whole. The contrast to the settlement is also read as a specific activity of the relationship between the space, the construction of the study of the city block of architecture, and the concept of a concept of form of the settlement. The surface is an architectural elements, and the design of the city is the composition. The relationship between the residential and constant expression of the city and the settlement as a composition. The form of a composition of the city elements of the settlement as a composition, the proportion of the city is. Okay, so that's not from Daniel's book pretty clearly, but I started to think get more at my understanding of the relationship to the discrete in my practice. The text I just read, that's actually the first time I read it, and it's total gibberish. But it's a text generated by a student of mine and an employee of my firm, Kenneth Cartledge, has been looking at using neural networks to develop architectural theory. So we spent the last day and a half feeding it Daniel's book and tried to see if it could write a Daniel Fuller architectural treatise on neurological. Still some bugs to work out, but I think what I want to begin to get into this is the notion that I use the discrete as a kind of method of interface. The way I store data in between systems is really how I begin to think about my architecture as a kind of interfacial architecture where the work I do is always about looking at mediating between multiple systems or intelligences within the architectural space. So consequently, within that text, the neural network basic that Kellen developed basically breaks down initially the text from Daniel's book into individual characters, then begins to kind of reinforce connections between characters to form words, extending that to sentences, and then extending that into whole paragraph forms, and eventually improves through repetitive training to produce things which become indistinguishable from a kind of human-generated conceptual treatise. So what we're doing there is breaking down the text into kind of a discrete array of elements and then overlaying structures on top of that to begin to bring a sort of coherence to it, which allows us to mediate between the types of intelligences of reading things that like an artificial intelligence would use and the types of intelligence that we expect from an anthropocentric point of view relative to understanding of content. This kind of the last couple of years I've begun to change my work, moving away from that kind of purely agent-driven, agent-figurative-based work to things which are kind of dealing more with the interface. I've been, this last year I've had the opportunity to teach a class with Benjamin Bratton, who's been writing extensively about the network culture, and his new book came out, The Stack. He has a couple quotes I think relate to some things I'm trying to push. Familiar architectural interfaces organize interior and exterior zones and borders between countries or interfaces between sovereign polities. Once an image can be used to control what it represents, it too becomes technology. Diagram plus computation equals interface. Only because they reduce and simplify complex systems can they make it possible for people to use those systems at a systematic scale and a realized platform value from them. Without coercing us, the interface cannot properly interface anything to us. As discrete human individuals believe themselves in charge of their tools, they nevertheless represent an increasingly particular, even marginalized type of user agent within a diverse throng of alternatives. Okay, so those are actual quotes, not made-up ones from our machine. And what I think it gets at is that both that there's architecture has a very long history within the discipline and the practice in relationship to designing threshold between systems, and particularly like this is a map, a medieval map of Milan, where there's a very clear and discrete threshold erected in between the kind of domesticated urban environment and the unruly, dangerous wilderness to the outside. And the interface becomes things like gates, porticos, windows, aperture, and so forth. And also, the other important thing I think that we need to look at, or an important fact of contemporary architecture and basically the state of humanity moving forward, is that we need to begin to understand architecture as a way to mediate between multiple types of intelligences or users within the space. The vast number of users on the internet now are not actually human agents. They are, in fact, autonomous bots or AI or crawlers and so forth. So along those lines too, there's an interest in Catherine Hale's discussion about the cognition and the subconscious in relationship to kind of pattern recognition and understanding of complex systems, and the fact that the kind of subconscious begins to operate as more close to how we think of synthetic computation, and that allows us to begin to mediate between complex systems and human occupants, not so much in terms of like an understanding of a totalistic understanding of the complex system, but through kind of local coherencies and interfaces within that larger framework. So this is like just a little kind of getting into what I'm starting to do, some of the things I'm starting to do in terms of two-dimensional work in the office, where I begin to look at manipulating pixel data, which is again a kind of discrete array of information, by overlaying multiple structures to give new meaning or order to that discrete data. So in this case, I'm using both kind of an agency that's pixel to pixel based to create a coherency or an order or a structure that maybe is not legible necessarily at the human level, and another species of agency which is beginning to operate in a kind of simulacrum to the human perception to look for inherent media within or characteristics that can be recognized, figurative elements within the image. So this is like some lips, but it's and this is kind of an overall shot. And this, all this is kind of operation that's placed out using various machine vision apparatus, like facial recognition, eye recognition, mouth recognition on Peter Paul Rubens' Massacre of the Innocents. And one of the things that I really like about this is the kind of apophonic quality that has been in discussion a lot around like Google's Deep Dream. But within this work, how things that I've found is that my eye detection can't tell the difference between the way Peter Paul Rubens draws an eyeball versus a nipple. And those lips are, in fact, this dude's torso. And those kind of superpositions and slippings in the understanding of the material are things that I find as interesting generative potential as a design space. I also wanted to kind of clarify, initially, when I heard the terms kind of discrete in relationship to this work, I wanted to clarify that unlike a Celer automata, the things that I do are not considered discrete topologically, which in mathematics is when, like in an array or a field, the end agents have fixed relationships to each other that never change over the course of the simulation, whereas in the stuff that I'm doing using kind of manipulations of contemporary algorithms like motion interpolation, which is something a lot of people use in After Effects probably, to stretch out the films, the pixels are constantly re-identifying which neighbors within the field set are important to them as a way to generate meaning from the discretized pixel data. And the other thing that I wanted to my initial kind of reaction was that most of my work now is also about trying to be extensive with the systems I operate in. So as before, I think in kind of generations above us, the idea was that the simulation for architecture took place exclusively within the computer. But in the contemporary world, computation has become a kind of adjective for things, which is another concept that Benjamin Bratton puts forth in its ubiquitousness is actually a kind of material, physical, human, multiple intelligences collapsed together, like in this FedEx shipping center. And in case this slide is confusing for some of you, I put this one in too, because I know like some of you guys have some issues relative to using real computers. This is also very evident in things like Waze, right, where we're using crowdsourced information on top of simulations, on top of physical positions of cars, overlaid on top of digital and virtual maps to create an improved physical infrastructure in the real world. So these types of extensive computing is what I'm interested in. So I was initially surprised about the kind of thinking about the idea of the discrete relative to this until I began to realize that all the systems I work with always use the kind of discrete raw data of the system in order to create information, whether it's real-time data from the New York MTA subway ridership to produce this kind of 40-foot map, or the discrete array of pixels, or this is the thing I made for a kind of app for some of my students that logs on to Google, takes Google Maps, takes a latitude and longitude and begins to extrude these voxel forms from 90-degree positions and creates these kind of panoramic animations of forms generated through image. And also, I do a lot of the work I'm doing is involving the robot lab at SIRC in combination with a guy there named Jake Newsom, who helps me develop software on the robot end, and I develop a kind of brain software on the computer end. We're looking at ways in which we can use kind of utilizing that discrete data, moving back and forth, in this case a point cloud, or again pixels with web cameras to mediate between a tooling, behavior, and a material consequence in a kind of endless real-time loop. In terms of the images, I'm just going to show, looks like I need to go a little bit faster. The painting on the left is by Rachel Rice, and the painting on the right, Anne Vallier-Coster. They're kind of contemporaries, Rachel Rice being Dutch and Anne Vallier-Coster is French. And I'm drawn more towards, in terms of its relationship to my work, purely for its technique rather than any kind of aesthetic appeal it has to me, although I do like it. In the Rachel Rice's work, it differs from a lot of her contemporaries in that it uses exclusively a precision of relationship of colors to each other in order to generate materiality. Whereas in Anne Vallier-Coster's, you can see like a more typical use of brush texturing and material properties in order to evoke those material properties in the painting. So the Rachel Rice approach becomes useful for me when I begin to think about how to construct intelligences relative to okay, Ryan, I'll take my time. As how to construct intelligences relative to the image, where I'm exclusively only operating with color-to-color relationships within the pixel grid in order to generate content or understanding or form. These are some examples of the work that I've been doing. The one on the left is looking at misappropriating things like blob detection, and the one on the right uses like two different systems. One is kind of a misappropriation of the pixel motion, which is giving you these kind of streaky, deformed structures to begin to highlight a kind of flow field within the composition of two images as they're superimposed, and then have a second set of species which is beginning to recompose stuff with a kind of more human-like understanding of composition, where it looks for regions of intensity and contrast and trying to find objects within the page. So you get this kind of superpositioning of machine-based intelligences, ones which are clearly trying to imitate or speak with the kind of human understanding of aesthetics, and ones which have maybe their own agenda. And the hope is that we start to define a new type of aesthetic, which is based more in give a certain amount of agency to those kind of ubiquitous algorithms that are continuously around us, like compression algorithms, motion interpolation, facial recognition, all these things which are kind of continuously deployed in our daily life through social media, or phones, whatever, but maybe don't really get at their opportunity as an agency within the design space. There's some array of pixel colors. It's 50 pixels. So all the data that I use, I always return everything between my systems back to this state. And what that allows me to do is to have multiple systems operating on it continuously and dynamically changing the set. without necessarily having to store these kind of massive files which carry certain already the kind of structural connections between them. So I allow the kind of multiple agencies to redefine the structures within this array of discrete information continuously in order to leverage multiple types of intelligences within a project. This got kind of blown up for installation that Marcel Spina and I did at the Chicago Biennial last fall. It was a 25-foot by a 7-foot print at 200 dpi, which it turns out is a bad thing to do if you're moving every single pixel in an image. But we basically began to lay, I think there's the images on the left and the right are both utilizing like 6 different types of intelligence to read and manipulate the content and generate sort of new textures, a kind of painterly effect. In some cases, a kind of grid-like behavior, which you can kind of clearly see, and sometimes where it's identifying evidence structures within the park. We kind of literally brought this up into 3D without any kind of understanding of material intention or behavior within that system for this project, which was a competition in Istanbul. We're literally projecting those same pixel-based behaviors into a voxel space. So at this point, the material intelligence of the agent-based systems that are operating in here really have nothing to do with any architectural intention. It is kind of purely exclusively operating still at the image level. It's just mapped into a 3-dimensional space, adding a third axis. And from there, we began to kind of hone in more on those techniques and start to develop a series of studies where we could begin to introduce more specific architectural behavior into and on top of those agent-based behaviors. This was a peer study that I was working on for the library competition that unfortunately haven't finished, but basically you can see here that in addition to kind of color behaviors and the compositional behaviors that I was exploring in the 2-dimensional imagery, I'm also beginning to build in behaviors to create 4 plates autonomously, generate both kind of orthogonal behaviors on the surface to produce kind of, I thought this was shelving. I'm not sure how great it is as shelving, but the outside is supposed to be shelving. And the diagonal structural behaviors on the interior of the course. So beginning to differentiate intelligence and behaviors in addition to the kind of agencies which are responding to image-based and color-based content, but also allowing other agencies to deploy to deal with things like massing, spatial organization, and material organization to the production, kind of 4 plates and piers. Some more shots of that guy. Extending it further, kind of took that concept into the kind of tower form, really looking at kind of more about planar organization and really this thing as a form. So with the individual 4 plates, I think that some kind of interesting formations come out, which kind of reminisce back to some things that Mies has done, but also in particular Alvar Aalto, where I've become interested in kind of deployment of within these fields of this kind of discrete tectonic elements, in this case, these kind of super thin columns, in the way that Aalto did, where it mediates between the idea of kind of a literal transparency and a phenomenal transparency by the accumulation of so many columns that they effectively become walls in places. But I'm interested in this idea of the kind of, again, going back to the interfacial notion of the architecture, that the architectural plan should not be, and an architectural design should be rooted more in understanding plan organization and interface than in kind of totalistic massing study. So the elements and the texturing and the agencies I'm operating at are a resolution which is understandable at local cognitive levels, but is not maybe understandable in a classical compositional sense. Some more views of that. It's a very moody rendering. Got to keep an eye on the interns. And then kind of along those same lines, we went way into the image-based stuff and started to look at taking some of the interactive things I was doing with the robot and the sculpting and started to build in more simulated precision as an interface between the kind of material, the sensors, the cameras, and the user input. I developed a tablet-based drawing application that allows users kind of real-time control of the robot. And basically what we do is we use a web camera, which you can kind of see them mounted next to the robots, to continuously scan the image and update it to the tablet, which allows the kind of 3 methods of engagement within the robot. One is a kind of one-to-one slaving of the robot arm to the tablet plan. The kind of middle ground one is that the robot begins to, and our agents begin to overlay precise repetitive motions on top of human engagement, which we call kind of augmented interface, which actually turns out to be the most productive. You can kind of see some of those things here. We see a lot of precise hatching. So if you draw a line, it overlays kind of precisely angled hatches onto that. And then the third one, which is actually where I started and where most of my interest is is in a kind of fully autonomous mode, where the robot uses a camera to scan the image and generate new paths, paints some stuff, pulls back, and repeats. It's actually only through kind of the introduction of myself to Jose Sanchez and his thinking that I actually even began to consider the human a worthwhile participant in these processes. It took me quite a while to actually appreciate that there might be some contribution from humans for the types of intelligences that we wanted to create. But it's been a very productive thing, and it's actually driven the work away from being kind of purely autonomous and repetitive. This is kind of three-dimensional version of that we're doing with 3D printing right now, a similar process, but in fully autonomous mode. I'll be overlaying the interactive modes to it. But I think that also, like, between the conversations, like with this thing, which is fully autonomous, to the things which have a kind of human engagement within the process, has, I think, opened up a lot more productivity and possibility about moving us away from the purely kind of immanent or the projective to being something which is kind of a daily integration into the design of the architecture. And specifically, I think both Benjamin Bratton and I think Jose Sanchez are pretty clear about that it's not so much about giving a hierarchy or a level of greater value to specific types of intelligences, but appreciating which forms of intelligence are best at kind of operating for certain problems. And then just as a kind of, these guys just presented this morning at MoMA. I actually ducked out of another conference to do this. These are some of my students that took my drawing application and began to use it as a form of microagriculture to begin to autonomously respond to, this case is slime molds, like mold growths, and to both feed and kill off molds through continuously scanning and manipulating them. It's basically the idea is that you could use these techniques to bring potentially harmful but also potentially beneficial microbial elements into the domestic space, and utilizing a kind of very patient and repetitive and type of intelligence in the artificial intelligence to maintain or mediate those relationships between the wilderness and the domestic. So kind of coming full circle back to that Milan project. I'll just kind of wrap this up. This is an installation that I did as a kind of test a couple of weeks ago, where we were laser etching mirrors and superimposing kind of glitched out videos of pornography on the reflections of the people in the space. Again, utilizing some of the image-based techniques that I talked about at the beginning of the lecture. This one also started to engage kind of interactivity, where the image in the middle is what happens after you stare at this thing for 10 seconds, and the one on the right is if you stare at it for like 30 seconds. So the idea is that the media content you see on the left, which is this kind of looping, glitched out pornographic material, only becomes evident through like just kind of creepily staring at this mirror for extended periods of time. So the longer you stare at this thing, the more kind of content gets revealed. And this exhibition was in a kind of, it was a one-night exhibition staged in I don't know, you guys have hourly hotels over there? Or you kind of get the drift? So it seemed like an appropriate type of content to display in that space, but I don't want you guys to get the idea that I'm constantly covering architectural services with pornography. And so we kind of expanded those techniques also now to kind of integrate the drone through kind of precise control of its flight paths in relationship to the human user in space, and some of the kind of imagery techniques. And these are some studies for some interactive media, which was going to be displayed at an exhibition coming up next Friday that I have to finish and fly back to LA and finish, where these kind of frames, which are this kind of voxelized space, or voxelized set of structures organize a plan that then gets those types of responsive and interactive media projected on them, and then also the kind of back wall of the gallery is going to get the big kind of drone vistas. So it's really looking at both conflating the formal and material processes and techniques for development, so the behaviors that generated this kind of 2x2. I kind of think like I'm a little bummed out by them. They look a little bit like Frank Lloyd Wright, just like had a really bad craftsman or something. But the idea is that there's a certain coherency and conflation of technique between the agent-based behaviors within the voxel grid that I used to generate these, and the same ones that are being used to generate the kind of hatching patterns on the mirrors, and also within the media themselves. So there's a kind of attempt here to conflate the kind of surveillance, the interactivity, and the materiality all into like one space of computation, continuously using that same framework where all of these forms of intelligence are continuously distributing discrete information back and forth to each other as a way of understanding interface between themselves within the architectural space. I think that's it.
Thanks, Cassie.